Well, then in 1930 was when my father and the family of us went out. And after about a year or so with Mr. Brennan, he could see that where they were going every year, it was just the same place and there was not much going on. And my father said to Mr. Brennan, look, he said, I've come out here to go to the new places where people hasn't been before. And he said, I'm going down to south of Nova Scotia. There hadn't been anybody down there yet. And so off he went. When he started out, he went down to a place called Avonport. That's where he started, and that's where he finished. When he got to Avonport that morning, he got off the train, and he had 10 cents left. He couldn't go any further. And so he went around Avonport to ask where he could board and where he could have meetings, and he found a hall at $5 a week. And he found board at $5 a week. And he had 10 cents with him at the time. He went all the week and he had meetings in the little hall. People were coming. But anyway, at the end of the week on the Friday, he was out visiting as usual. He came to a certain door. He knocked the door and a woman came. And he said to her, we're having meetings down in the little hall here. We'd like for you to come along. She says, what are you telling people? Well, he says, we're telling them man's ruin and God's remedy. And she says, what's God's remedy? Well, he said that Christ died on the cross to save sinners. She says, come on in. He went in and he found that she was a widow woman that was praying that somebody would come for years to that little community with the gospel. She was saved by God's sovereign grace. When he left, shaking hands with her, she put something in his hand. He knew it was money. And he said to her, no, he said, I can't take that. She says, you have to take it. No, he says, I can't take that from a widow woman. Well, she said, you're not taking it from a widow woman, you're taking it from the Lord, because I've had to set aside for a long time for the person that comes along. I knew that God would answer my prayer and send somebody. And so when he got outside, he found it was $2.50. That was half of the board. He went to the post office on the way home, and Mother had sent him a letter. He opened it, and there was another $2.50. That was the whole board. He went past the place where he was having the meetings, and there was a man out at the back unloading a load of wood. He went around and he said to him, what are you doing? He says, I've been enjoying these meetings, so he says, I'm putting off this load of wood, and he says, that'll pay the rent for this week. And so the thing went on. That's the way it went on for quite a while. He stayed there for I don't know how long, but he didn't think there was anything going on, so he moved on. But 20 years later, he met a woman. And she says, do you know who I am? No, he says, I never saw you before. Yes, she says, you did. And she says, I listened to you preaching in Avonport. And she says, I got saved by God's sovereign grace. 20 years later, he found it out. Well, then he went on down to Bridgewater. He could see there that there was an interest. So he came back to Debert, where we had already been, and we were staying there. He came back there and he asked the man if he would take our stuff down to Bridgewater. Christian man. He had a truck or a lorry, whatever you call it. He said, yes, I'll take it down for so much money. Well, Dad had that much. So he took him down. But when he got there, he says to him now, he says, Mr. McIlwaine, he says, it's but further than I thought it was, and I'm going to have to live a little more. So my father had just enough to give him the extra, and away he went. Well, the first few weeks there was kind of dry. My father said he was told at different times he had two menus. The one was potatoes and porridge, and when we got tired of that, it was porridge and potatoes. You know, I just found out last week that's all a person needs. They say that that's all you need. You could live on that. Well, God was good to us, wasn't he? But one night, oh, I'll never forget. I was about 6. We always had to read the Bible before we went to bed, and Dad would pray. But this night when we got down on our knees, I'll never forget it. He said, oh Lord, I don't mind going to bed myself hungry. But he says, here's the wife and children, and they need something to eat. And he broke and could say nothing more. We no more than got up from our knees when there was a knock at the door. It was late because it was after a meeting. My mother went to the door, and there was a man standing there. He says, "Do you like Gasparot?" She says, "What's that?" "Well," he says, it's fish. It's something like herring." "Oh, well," she says, we like fish all right, but we can't get any tonight." "Look," he says, "I've been around the doors here for the last while," and he says, "I'm trying to get rid of a dozen or so, and I can't get rid of them." He says, "Would you mind taking them off my hands? I don't want to throw them out." "Oh, no," she says, "we won't mind." He was no more around the corner, boy, and the pan was on the stove. Well, that's the way the Lord supplied the need. Just a few days after that, my father had to take my mother to the hospital. She went to the doctor, and he said she's got to go right in for an operation. And of course, he didn't have any money. But she went to the hospital. 3 days later, he went back to the hospital. Of course, he went before, but he went back to the doctor, and he says, "How much do I owe you?" He says, "You got paid already." "Yes," he said, "the money has come in." So he paid the doctor, and the doctor said, "Well, if you're going to pay it that quick," he says, "I'll take so much off." So he went to the hospital, and he asked what that would cost for the operation. And he paid that. And he went back home with the same amount as before. It's wonderful how God comes in. I'm just saying these things just to impress you that if there's somebody here tonight that's thinking about God's work, you don't have to worry about anything in the world. God will supply the need if he has called you to do that work. Of course, if he hasn't called you, then you may run into problems. But if God has given you a call to do something for himself, he'll supply the need, whatever that is. I'm convinced of that, because I saw it happen. That's one thing I've never had to worry about. When I started out different places to have meetings, it never bothered me about the finances, because I never had to learn that. I have great respect for men that have had good jobs and leave them and go out to preach the gospel and have never had this learned before but have to learn it. I have respect for those men. I didn't have to learn that. I saw it happen in the home. The meetings began in different places. I'll cut out some of it, but we got to Baker Settlement, a little place called Baker Settlement, and there was an old church building there. Mr. Brennan had come along by this time to help my father with the meetings, and the Baker Settlement old church building had been vacant for years, and he got that, and now there was 150 people coming every night, or every Sunday night, and 100 people on the weeknights. They were crowding in from all through. They were coming through the woods. They were just like coming out of the woodwork. And they were coming in horses, and they were coming in old rattle-trap cars, and they were walking, and they were coming from all over. Some of them walking 3 and 4 miles, night after night. And as they were coming along, you could hear them singing through the woods the songs that they've been learning from the gospel. People had never heard the gospel before. One after another was getting saved. But there was a woman in the community who didn't like it. She was a very religious woman. That's usually the kind. And she offered these wild characters, there was a dozen or so of them. She says, "If you can disturb those meetings and get these people run out of here, I'll give you a keg of beer and $5. Religious woman. Well, anyway, they couldn't get it, to end that story, they couldn't get the meeting stopped. And so they went along and they stole enough hens for the $5 and they stole the keg of beer. So she lost out both ends. But one night when we got there was only a few people. My father says to the people that were standing there, says, "Where's everybody tonight?" "Oh," they said they were going to blow the building up, and if they're going to blow the building up, we'll be along with you. Oh, he said, "They'll never do that." But Mr. Brennan was preaching. And the first thing my father heard the racket outside, and he ran out. And here they were, those boys gathered together, and one big fellow with a dynamite down at the edge of the hall, and he was pulling the boards off to get the dynamite in. And my father wondered, what in the world am I going to do? He knew very well he didn't dare say a word, because they were a rough bunch. And so he went over and he got down beside the fellow where he was pulling the boards off. He got right down alongside him and looked into his eyes. Well, he couldn't keep going that way. And he jumped up and he started cursing and swearing, telling him to take his glasses off, what he would do. Of course, my father just stood and watched them and looked at him. And then he went into the inside there, into the porch, and he started pulling the big rope, pulling the bell. And Mr. Brennan preaching inside. And the bell was tolling. And his old uncle inside that was coming to the meetings, his uncle, he heard this racket, and he came out. And he said to my father, he said, I'll not let these men hurt you, Mr. McIlwaine. And just of that, the nephew, the big fella, he actually caught him around the throat and started squeezing, and my father could see what was going to happen. Of course, my dad was very strong. He just wrapped his arms around the little man, and he threw him inside, tore him away from the big fella, and threw him inside. He said, you stay in there. I'll handle these boys. And closed the door behind him, turned around, and the fella looked at him for a minute. And then he went out and made a lot of noise and what he was going to do and all the rest of it. He'd be back the next night and all that. Well, in spite of all that, the meetings kept on going. I was wishing they would stop because I was scared to death. I didn't know what was going to happen next. I was only a little lad. One night we got there and we couldn't get into the door. My father says, he says, come around here to the back, he says, and I'll put you through a window and you can go in and see what's in behind that. Well, I didn't dare say no to my father, but I'm telling you, I didn't want to go in there. I didn't know but there was a bunch of men in there. Well, anyway, I went in, and of course it was just all boarded up with 2x4s and 2B8s and all the rest of it. And so we tore the boards down, and they got in. But the people started getting saved. Those people that were coming from different places, they started getting saved. The first one was saved was a little school teacher. And she lived for many years to prove God's salvation in the community where she was. And she just died a couple of months before my father did. She was over 90 years of age when she went home to glory. But she was one of the first. And then her family, one after another, got saved. And then more and more until there was quite a few. Well, then my father started working around other places. The next thing was Hemford. When the merchants in Bridgewater, where we were living, heard that we were going to Hemford, they said, never, you're never going up there. Now, that's ridiculous. My father said, well, he said, that's where I'm going. He said, well, some of them said, you'll never come back from there. They're a wild bunch up there. They believe in witches. And they'll do anything. They'll think nothing of taking your life. Well, he says, that's the place where the gospel's needed then. And so, you're not taking your family with you. Oh, yes, they're going to. When we got up there, my older sister, Margaret, she was 4 years older than I am. And when we heard all these stories, we were so afraid that we used to go weave back and forth going across the road, going to school, so that nobody get a good shot at us. Silly little beings as we were. But nevertheless, we were afraid. Well, we got into Hemford, and he started working around Nineveh. I was out in Vancouver one time. Mr. Frank Knox was there. He had 6 weeks meetings. They were great meetings. The last night, the place was packed like this. And there was a big platform there, hold about 50 people. And the people were sitting on the platform all around him. He was up here, and he was going at it like only Frank Knox could. And all of a sudden he turned, he looked at me. Of course, he knew me pretty well because of my father, because he always was around where my father was when Dad was home here. And he looked at me and he says, where were you saved, young man? I said, 2 miles from Nineveh. You what? He says, 2 miles from Nineveh. He says, God help us, there's a man here tonight from Nineveh. And of course, you can imagine how the people felt about that. I could have told them Hemford, but that's the way it came out. Because Nineveh was where the assembly was, you see. Well, people started getting saved there. The people that believed in witches. There was one family. I went to school with 2 of the boys. Their eldest brother, he's in Halifax Insane Asylum even right now because of witches. The old witch doctor, there was something wrong with him, and he went to the witch doctor, and he told the witch doctor what was wrong, and he says, what your problem is your closest friend is your witch, and you'll have to get rid of him. His closest friend was his uncle. He actually went home and got the shotgun and went up and shot his uncle. When he was brought to court about it, the old witch doctor said, I told him to draw a heart. a picture of a heart on a piece of paper and shoot through that. And that's the way he got cleared. It's so bent on that young man's mind. I say again, right now, he's in the Halifax Insane Asylum. He's been there for years. I went to school with his two brothers. They used to put hens in the oven alive to get rid of the witches. That old witch doctor just kept them out under his spell, and you'd never know what next he would do in order to keep them that way. Well, some of those people that believed in the witches, they started getting saved. They began to realize this was all a hoax. And they started getting saved, and one after another, until the first thing, there was a nice little assembly there. And that wasn't too far from West Clifford and Baker Settlement where we were first, and were those people, and they started coming up there to the meeting, and different ones were baptized and received into fellowship. The work went on like that. And Dad worked all around that community for years, and Mr. Brennan came along with him, and then John McCracken would be with him, and they would have meetings all over the place. Then it came a time when my father wasn't feeling very well. So I'd been away working for a while and back home again. I was about 15 now, and my father said to John McCracken one time, he says, "You mind if he goes along with you and he has some meetings with you? He'll open the meetings for you and so on." So John said, "That's fine." And we worked together like that for a while. We got along good together. One night, we'd been there for about 8 weeks in this little tent, canvas tent. I was running out of things to say. That's not hard for me. And I looked down into the people and I said, "I can see the devil sticking right out of your eyes." After the meeting was over, we had our little lunch together in the trailer, and John says, "Now look," he said, "that's just not the proper thing to say to people, you know." And he gave me and a lot of different times like that, he would give me a little bit of a, well, I said, "You made a mistake too." "Oh," he said, "what did I say?" He talked about the man that got up in the middle of the night and harnessed his horse and away he went to help. He says, "I didn't say that." I said, "You did." And he wouldn't believe it until the school teacher came along the next day and we asked her, and she said, "Yes, he did." Mr. Brennan came along, and my father was having meetings away in a place not, about 30 miles away. And Mr. Brennan and him had some meetings. And then the last 3 weeks, again, my father's ulcers were kicking up so bad, he couldn't handle it. And he says, "Mr. Brennan, do you mind if Robert goes along with you? And he'll open the meetings for you," and so on. I was about 16 now, or a little more than that. He said, "No," he said, "that's fine." He was a very gracious man, godly man. I never heard a man preach the gospel as plain as he could. And I had the privilege of being with that man for the last 3 weeks he preached. And I counted a privilege. We'd sit on the bank of the Mersey River in the afternoon, and he would open his Bible. And he told me different things, and he said one thing I'll never forget. He says, "There's never a question that can ever arise in an assembly or in a personal life but what there's an answer for in God's Word." But he said, "You'll have to read it." His high blood pressure was so high that when we'd go to the tent, he'd have to hold on to the desk in front of him. He was so dizzy. But night after night for those 3 weeks, he preached the gospel like he never preached before. The last night, the Friday night, he preached from Ezekiel 33. "Hear the word of my mouth and warn them from me. Tell them, as I live, saith the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked." Now he says, "I want to clear your blood of my skirt forever." And he said, "I'm telling you plainly, there is a heaven to gain and a hell to shun." And he preached that night so plain that one woman, when she went out, who had just been saved a few days before, she said, "That man was inspired tonight." And I don't think there was a dry eye in the place. There was about 70 people. He says, "I may never preach again." But he says, "I want to warn you. Hear the word at my mouth and warn them from me." Saturday morning we got up, and he says, "I think I should go back home. I'm not feeling well." And so my mother and Sadie and I, we took him down to Bridgewater, to the railroad station about 25 miles away. When we were going into the station, he handed my mother the key of the hall. He always kept that from year to year. He said, "Mrs. McIlwaine, I won't need this anymore." He said, "I'm going home." Of course, in my simplicity, I thought he meant going home to New Glasgow. But she explained to me on the way home, no, he means he's going home to heaven. And you know, when the truth of that burst in my soul, I could hardly believe it. That Mr. Brennan, who had been with us for so many years, is actually going home to heaven. Can't be. But a week exactly, the Friday night, he passed into the presence of the Lord. And when I got the message, all I could think of was, hear the word at my mouth, warn them from me. Because that morning when we put him onto the train, I put his suitcase down beside him. He turned around, and with the tears streaming down his face, as he put his hand in mine to say goodbye, he says, Robert, hear the word at my mouth, and warn them from me. And for weeks, out in the hayloft, spend hours trying to think of what to do, what God would have me do. And I would go into the house again and say to my father, where is a good place to have meetings? And he would tell me different places he had been and good meetings and so on. And my mother would say, now, if you go there, you could stay with Mrs. So-and-so, because she knew them. But nothing seemed to click. One night, my mother said, we'll take so-and-so home, Mr. and Mrs. Beck, we'll take them home down to West Clifford. So we did. And on the way back, she says, we'll go in and see Mr. and Mrs. Huey. They were old people, not well. They had been in the assembly, but they had to stay home. She was in bed. Mother went in to see her in the back bedroom. I was talking to the old man Huey. In the course of the conversation, he said, Robert, he said, tell your father sometime to go out to Clementsvale. I said, what do you mean? He says, to have meetings out in Clementsvale. I've got a nephew out there, and it'd be a good place to have meetings. Well, sir, it just clicked like that. That's the place. When I got into the car to come home, I said to Mom, I know where I'm going. She says, where? Clementsvale. Where's that? I don't know. But I said, we'll have to get a map and find out. It's out in Annapolis Valley someplace. Well, she says, how'd you hear about that? Well, Owen told me he had a nephew out there, and tell Dad to have meetings, but I'm going to go. Well, the next 3 days, we're getting ready. The bicycle was being prepared, getting the tracks together and the hymn books and so on, tied on to the parcel carrier. 60 miles away we found dirt roads, and the road just a glare of ice. On the Wednesday, Dad said, you really going to go? I said, yes. Well, he said, you'd better take the car. He says, you can't go out in a thing like that. Take the car. Of course, he hadn't said anything about taking the car before, because the gas was rationed those days. It was during the war. And the gas was rationed, so he said, he never used the car at all, hardly. But now he says, if you're really going to go, you'll have to take the car. Well, Thursday morning, he went away early. He never liked to say goodbye. So he went away, and my mother followed me out to the car. She says, you're really going to go? Yes, I said, yeah, going. Finally, she threw her arms around my neck. She began to cry. She says, go ahead. All heaven's at your back. With that, she turned and ran for the house. I didn't know what was going to be in the next few miles, but she understood because she'd been through it, you see. The first 20 miles, it came to me this way. Who do you suppose told me? You don't know your Bible. You haven't got John McCracken with you now. And your father's not with you. Mr. Brennan's not here. And if anybody asks you hard questions, what are you going to tell them? You don't know your Bible that well either. It seems so ridiculous, going off by myself. I turned around in Caledonia Square and started for home. I got about a mile, and then I could see Mother's face again, and she says, all heaven is at your back. And I thought, if all heaven's at my back, there's nothing to worry about. I turned around, started again. Now the next thing came to my mind was, what are you going to do with $5? Because that's all I had in my pocket. I didn't know at that time about going to Avonport with 10 cents left, but I knew that the Lord always supplied the need before, and I suppose I just wasn't thinking along that line. But now, the devil puts it in. And he says, if you get a place to have meetings with $5, how long is that going to last? You're not going to have very many meetings. And if somebody asks you for board, well, they'll need at least $5 a week for board. How long is that going to last? Well, it just seems so ridiculous. I turned around again. Got back down the road a little way, and the same thing came. All heaven is at your back. So I got out and turned the car again and started. Got down to Clementsvale. I went to Joe and Huey, his nephew. He says, I'll take you right to the place. And so that night we went out after he was done work and had supper, went out to Greenland, which is about 7 miles from Clementsvale. This is Nova Scotia, not the icy mountains or the icy north, but a little place called Greenland. Went into the first trustee of the school, and we asked him if we could have the school for meetings. Well, he said, well, I suppose you could have the school all right, but why not have the church? He said, you know, there's the organ and everything. Organ. Now I'm up against the first snag. What am I going to do now? You see, I didn't have Dad with me. Didn't have John. You know, if I had John McCracken with me, he could tell him, well, what am I going to say? So it just come to me this way. Look, I said, the teacher can put a log of fire in the fire before she leaves the school, and it'd be nice and warm. But if we go into the church building, it's going to be cold every night. Oh well, he said, you want to have it there? That's good enough. In the schoolhouse. Went to the next trustee, was his father-in-law. He was sitting back rocking away there, a great big corncob pipe, and you could hardly see him for smoke. When I asked him if we could have the schoolhouse for meetings, he said, well, look, he says, anybody that wants to do anything for the master, it's all right for me. So we had the schoolhouse. Sunday night came, that was Thursday. So then, went Friday and Saturday, going around the people, telling them about the meetings in the schoolhouse. Sunday night came, the people started coming. And I guess I just hadn't thought of it that way. I don't know what I was thinking about, but I hadn't anything to tell them. I had no sermon. So I went around to the back of the woodhouse, brushed away some of the snow from one of the blocks, got down my knees, and I said, oh Lord, the people's coming. I don't know what to tell them. Back in again, and by this time there's about 45 people into the schoolhouse. I went up the front and gave out that hymn, Tell Me the Story of Jesus. Right on my heart, every word. They were Baptist people, but the Baptists in our country is not like the Baptists here. There's only one or two that's saved out of a lot. Because they believe in their baptism as their salvation. But anyway, they knew this hymn. Well, they started singing. I thought to myself, that's just what I'll tell them. So I turned to Matthew 27 and spoke from the Lord Jesus. Well, then my father came along, and he stayed for 3 weeks. I was there for 10 weeks. He came along, and he stayed for 3 weeks, and he found out that there was a real interest. And he came home to where we were. We sold out everything, and we moved over there to Clementsvale. That's where the assembly started. And the first Sunday morning, I'll never forget, after a baptism, the day before, we sat down with 12 people. John McCracken, and the preacher that was preaching with him, Bob McCracken and his wife, my father and mother, and 12 of the people that had been saved. The grass was growing up through the floor. The sun was streaming through between the boards. There was no outside shingles or anything. But as those people started to sing, and thank God, some of them got stood up on their feet, and they'd hardly say anything, and they'd sit down again. And they gave out that hymn number 6. By the time we got to the 3rd verse, Robert McCracken was the only one singing. And everyone with their heads bowed and the tears running. They appreciated the assembly of God for the first time. We moved down to another house because we were able to get rid of that one, and there was another place nearer. So we moved down to the other house. When we moved into that house, they said that they were going to give us a hot reception. In other words, they're going to burn it down. But the day that we moved in, they were dragging the lake for the 4 men that had said they were going to give us a hot reception. That put a spell on that place. And some of the ones that were relatives of those men that were so hard against the gospel, it softened them. And they started coming. But the meetings were going on, and I used to go out to the Greenland and bring the people in with an old car. And you know, they knew that our tires were rationed in those days. We couldn't even get tires. I used to take these old tires that were out back of the garages that had great big splits in them that had blown apart. And I would take one tire, put it over the top of the other, where the split wasn't, and bolt it together. You know, bolt the split together with the other tire inside, and of course that would last for a night or two. But they knew that we were having trouble with the tires. And the boys would stand up at the top of the hill there. And when I would go by, one would whistle. And then they knew it was me coming. And of course, when I get down to the bottom of the hill and hard to get the brakes on, they would pull a plank across the road and full of nails to try to ruin the tires. But anyway, God was in the work there, and there was people getting saved, and the assembly was going on. But finally, it came to the time where we're going to change the barn of this place, this house that Dad got, change the barn into a hall. Well, the barn had only low ceilings in it and partitions. And somebody told my father that he had great big beams up there, you know, great big square beams, wooden beams, 30 feet long. And he said, you can have them. So we had to gut out the whole thing. And we get the car and go up and get these beams and drag them down the road. You couldn't do it now. Drag these beams down behind the car. And he would take the heaviest end. Now, here I was about 18 about this time. I thought I was fairly strong. And I would struggle along with the smallest end, and we'd take it in, and he'd climb up the step ladder and put the thing on his sill, and then he'd come back and help me put mine up. And then he would go into the house. He'd get another dose of baking soda for the ulcers. He'd get a hot water bottle, one of those rubber ones, and stick it down beneath his belt there, and he'd come out. Now he says, well, go get another one. And that's the only rest I got was when he was getting the baking soda. Came 5 o'clock, we'd eat a meal, and then we had to go 30 miles for a meeting. He was made of iron. I never saw a man like him. Well, we weren't there very long. We got the hall nicely finished, just nicely finished. When somebody was putting a fire on for the meeting on Saturday night, they were putting a fire on around 4, and the first thing somebody shouted, look at the smoke. We went out, and the thing was on fire. And it just cleaned the whole thing, house and everything. I wondered how my father would take that. But a woman who was an enemy, because the neighbors all gathered, they saw the smoke for miles. And the neighbors gathered, and the woman that was the enemy, in fact, the McClellans are living in the house she was in now. She came along, she said to my father, that's quite a loss you have there. Yes, he says, it is. Any insurance? No, he says, no insurance. Oh, she says, that's terrible. Of course, she didn't mean it. She thought it was great. He said, well, the Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I had to go away someplace and have a little cry to myself. I couldn't believe that he would feel that way about it. But you know something? Just the week before that, or a couple of weeks before that, somebody had bought this old dance hall, and they brought it up along the road and stuck it right across the road from where the hall was. Just across the road. And they were going to have dances in it, and they were going to disturb the meetings that way. So my father went over and asked them if they would sell the dance hall. Yes, they said they would. They didn't have the money to finish it. And so we just dragged that across the road over the top of the old foundation. Now we had a bigger hall than ever. The other one was getting obsolete anyway. So we got rid of the dance hall in front of the hall, and the Lord supplied the need in building this new hall, and it's a better one anyway. The Lord is coming. God help us that we might, the few fleeting days at our disposal, that we might make use of it. I'll tell you this one thing and then I'll stop. 1960, I think it was. My mother was, I'm not sure of the year, but my mother and father were 60 years of age. They were building a hall in Avonport because that's where my father came back to. He started off there and he came around Nova Scotia, and that's where he finished off. And the last hall that he had anything to do with, he bought an old jailhouse from the army. And they went and they cut it down in sections. And they hauled it to Avonport, and they put it up in the yard where the house is standing now. Little by little they got it up. One day, of course, there was a lot of men used to come and help them putting it up. I think Norman Crawford was there at that time. He was having meetings 80 miles away and he used to come up and help in the daytime and go back to the Clementsvale for meetings. One day, there was about 15 of them in for dinner. They were living in what you call a caravan, but we call it a house trailer. And Mother was getting the dinner. When she didn't sit down, my father said to her, "Now, Sarah, are you having something to eat?" No, she says, you go ahead and have something to eat, and she says, "I'll look after that afterwards." But he mistrusted something. After everybody went out, he went out with them, and he came back in again. He says, "Sarah," she was washing the dishes, "you didn't have anything to eat." No, she says, "Well, I don't need anything now. Don't worry about me." He says, "There was nothing left, was there?" No, she says, "There wasn't." But she said, "That's all right, don't worry about it." You know, he sat down and he cried like a child. He said, "Why didn't you tell me? You could have had half of mine." She sat down beside him. She hooked her arm in his. She says, "Lennon, if we live this 60 years and 10, we've got 10 more years left. Let's make it the best 10 of our lives." I tell you, she was a woman that I believe at the judgment seat of Christ will get the greatest reward. My father was a great leader, that's true. But I'll tell you, she was the backbone behind it. And God will bless her, and he'll bless anyone that will go in for pleasing God until traveling days are done.